For decades, the Soviet Union trusted one promise above all others. Nothing crossed its skies unseen. This wasn't optimism, it was doctrine. Radar stations stretched across thousands of kilometers, from frozen forests to remote mountain ranges. Operators sat underground, staring at glowing screens, trained to believe that invisibility was a fantasy invented by the West. If an aircraft existed, radar would find it. If radar found it, the system would respond. That certainty shaped every decision. And then, one night, the certainty vanished, without noise, without warning, without explanation. The radar screens were calm, too calm. Operators reported routine conditions, no unidentified contacts, no deviations, no alarms. Yet somewhere above Soviet territory, an American aircraft was moving through protected airspace, not aggressively, not recklessly, but with quiet confidence. There were no interceptors scrambling because there was nothing to intercept. From the system's point of view, the sky was empty. The most sophisticated air defense network on Earth was staring into a lie it didn't know how to recognize. To understand why this moment mattered, you need to understand how deeply radar was woven into Soviet identity. Soviet air defense wasn't just military infrastructure, it was psychological armor. It represented control in a world defined by fear. Missiles and bombers were terrifying, but they were predictable. Radar made them manageable. Early detection created time, time created decisions, and decisions prevented catastrophe. That was the logic. Break radar and the entire chain collapsed. What Soviet planners never fully considered was that radar could be defeated without being attacked. American engineers weren't focused on overpowering Soviet defenses. They weren't racing for higher speeds or higher altitudes alone. Instead, they asked a quieter question. What if radar wasn't something you had to fight? What if you simply obeyed its rules so precisely that it never noticed you at all? Radar waves move in predictable patterns. They reflect in predictable ways. If you control how those waves return or don't return, the radar doesn't fail. It reports exactly what it believes to be true. And somewhere inside the Soviet system, that truth was about to become deeply uncomfortable. Back in the radar room, operators did what they were trained to do. They recalibrated equipment. They verified signal strength. They checked synchronization across stations. Everything appeared normal. That was the most disturbing part. When machines fail, humans know how to respond. When machines work perfectly and still deliver the wrong answer, doubt spreads quietly. Reports from other intelligence channels hinted at activity radar could not confirm. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be escalated, just enough to unsettle the people who understood the system best. The radar data said the sky was empty. Other fragments of information suggested it was not. And there was no procedure for that contradiction. The real shock didn't happen during the flight itself. It happened later, in windowless rooms where analysts compared data that refused to align. Soviet intelligence had always assumed that airspace violations would be obvious, loud, confrontational. This was neither. The possibility that an aircraft could pass through without triggering a single alert forced a terrifying re-evaluation. If radar couldn't see everything, then warning time could disappear entirely. And without warning, there was no buffer between peace and irreversible action. This realization carried consequences far beyond espionage. During the Cold War, every system was built to avoid surprise. Surprise created panic. Panic created mistakes. And mistakes under nuclear conditions meant cities erased in minutes. An undetected aircraft wasn't just a technological problem, it was a strategic nightmare. It suggested that the balance of deterrence rested on assumptions that might already be outdated. And once that idea took hold, it spread quietly through the Soviet command structure, changing the way officers looked at their own defenses. What disturbed them most was not what had happened, but how long it might have been happening without their knowledge. What made this moment uniquely American wasn't just the technology itself, but the discipline surrounding it. There was no announcement, no demonstration, no attempt to humiliate Soviet defenses publicly. That restraint was intentional. The real power came from uncertainty. If the Soviets didn't know when their airspace had been penetrated, they also didn't know when it might happen again. That uncertainty forced overreaction, paranoia, and internal fracture, far more effective than open confrontation. Inside the Soviet system, responses followed familiar patterns. More radar stations were proposed, more power, more redundancy. But some engineers understood the uncomfortable truth. You can't solve a conceptual problem with brute force. Increasing signal strength doesn't help when the signal never comes back. The flaw wasn't in the hardware, it was in the belief system behind it. From that point forward, Soviet air defense planning quietly changed. Not publicly, not officially, but the certainty was gone. The sky no longer felt controlled, and control, once lost, is almost impossible to reclaim. Every empty radar screen now carried an unspoken question. Is it empty, or are we simply unable to see what's there? The Cold War is often remembered through dramatic moments, missile crises, speeches, standoffs broadcast to the world. But its direction was shaped just as much by silent moments like this, when nothing happened. No alarms, no response, just a system faithfully reporting data that no longer matched reality. In the end, the most dangerous thing in that radar room wasn't an American aircraft. It was the realization that the rules had changed, and the people responsible for defending the sky were the last to know. Once that realization set in, it couldn't be undone. And from that moment on, every sweep of the radar carried a quiet fear, not of what might appear, but of what never would.